Out where the sky stretches too wide to hide your sorrow, and the wind seems to carry stories no one dared finish. A train stopped, and off stepped a woman most folks wouldn't have noticed if not for the way she stood. Straight-backed, quiet, holding a letter in one hand and nothing else but a threadbare bag clutched to her side like it held her last hope. Her name was Mabel. She wasn't young. She wasn't slim. She wasn't the kind of woman stories used to get written about, but she had believed in one. A mail-order ad promising love, a warm hearth, a man who wanted a wife of gentle spirit and full heart. That ad didn't mention size or age, or that kindness in the West could be bought and twisted into cruelty. By the time she arrived, the truth was waiting like a blade. The man wasn't there, not really, just his brother, grinning drunk, said it was all a joke, that the letters were sent for fun, that no one wanted a woman with a face worn like hers and hips made for sinking, not dancing. Then he laughed, and everyone else on the platform did too. Except one man. He didn't speak then, just watched. A quiet rancher with hands like worn leather and eyes that didn't flinch. He saw her, saw the way she stood even as the laughter circled her like buzzards. He watched her pick up her empty bag, nod to no one, and walk away into a town that hadn't offered her a room, a ride, or even an apology. And maybe that was the moment the story began. Not the ad, not the train, not the insult, but the walk. The choice not to crumple. Because somewhere past the saloon, past the judgment, past the years that told her she was too much or not enough, someone else was waiting, not to save her, but to stay. And if you've ever wondered what happens to the ones the world laughs at, if you've ever felt like the punchline instead of the promise, this story is for you. She was called too fat for any man, but one rancher looked at her and said, "From poor to rich, you're my home now," and that changed everything. Want to know what happens next? The wind knows, and we're about to follow it. Out where the prairies stretch like a quilt sewn by forgotten hands, where wind moves slow and steady, like an old man in prayer, there lived a woman named Mabel Wynn. 52 round as the moon with wrists wide from years of kneading dough and hanging linens. Her hair the color of ash, in old wheat she wore braided and pinned like a quiet crown. Mabel had known many kinds of silence, the silence of rooms with no laughter, the silence after slammed doors, and the silence of a heart grown tired of being bruised. Her late husband, Harold Wynn, hadn't been a cruel man, but he hadn't been kind either. Marriage had come not from love, but from obligation. Her father arranged it when she was 20 because Harold had a mule, and you have wide hips, he said. She'd been told that was enough, and for years she told herself the same. But when Harold passed suddenly in the middle of fixing a wheelbarrow, what Mabel felt wasn't grief. It was quiet. A space in her chest opened up not from sorrow, but from air she hadn't known she'd been holding in. She spent the next few years alone in their tiny Missouri cottage, tending roses, feeding hens, and writing little poems she never showed to anyone. The world told her she was past her prime. Too round, too old, too quiet. Still, she listened to the stories other women whispered at the market, of second chances, of love found out west. And so one January morning, with her shawl drawn tight and her fingers trembling slightly, Mabel responded to a mail-order bride advertisement clipped from the back of a farmer's gazette, looking for a good woman to build a good life. Looks unimportant, must enjoy simple living and be willing to start again. E.L. Wyoming territory. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd ever been offered freely. She wrote the reply on the back of a sewing pattern, told him about her bread baking and her soft voice. Didn't mention her size, didn't apologize for her age. Just said, "I'm a woman who still believes kindness is a skill worth sharing." Weeks passed. Then a letter came short, handwritten in blocky penmanship. "You sound steady. Come if you like. Wagon will meet you March 14th. Dress warm." There was no name, just initials. But something about the bluntness made her believe it was real. She sold what little she had, gave away the hens, packed her poems in an old biscuit tin, and carried one small satchel. Inside it, a wool dress, a bread recipe, and a hand-carved spoon her mother had given her. The bag was nearly empty, but she carried it like it was full of treasure. The train ride west was long and cold. People didn't speak much to her. A few stared at her soft figure, the way her hands trembled when she pulled on gloves too tight at the wrist. But Mabel kept her gaze on the window, where the land slowly flattened into silence. When she stepped off the final train into Dry Willow Station, the sky was pearl gray and the wind sharp with promise. A man nearby barked orders at a horse. Children stared. One woman laughed into her scarf, but no one greeted her. She stood there with her bag, alone. A boy, maybe 14, approached, red-nosed and sheepish. "You, Mabel," he mumbled. "Yes." He handed her a folded note. "Mr. Lester said, give you this." Then he ran. The note read, "Didn't know you were built like that. No need to come. Go back." No signature, just the stamp of humiliation. A giggle from behind a woman had seen the paper. Another whispered, "She thought she'd find a man with that bag." Mabel didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just sat on a bench made of rough pine, her hands folded over the satchel that suddenly felt heavier than it ever had. Not from weight, but from shame. Still, she didn't stand up. Not yet. Not when the wind began to bite. Not when the station master asked if she needed to return east. She whispered only, "I'll wait a while," because part of her quiet, soft, stubborn, still believed someone might show up. And maybe, just maybe, she was meant to stay. It was near dusk when the wagon rolled past again. Mabel had been sitting there for over 2 hours. The station emptied out. A dog wandered by and laid its head on her shoe for a while, then left. No one came to collect her. No apology, no second note. Just a growing silence and the ache in her lower back. The cold nipped through her boots. Still, she didn't leave. Not until the sound of hooves slowed and a voice not loud, not urgent, just steady, said, "Ma'am, are you waiting for someone?" She turned her head. He was not what she expected. The man was tall in a worn coat, one sleeve pinned where an arm used to be. His beard was streaked with gray, and his eyes, not sharp but not timid, were the color of wet earth. He didn't step too close, didn't invade her space, just stood near enough that she didn't feel alone anymore. "I was supposed to meet someone," Mabel said. Her voice caught. "But I think they changed their mind." The man nodded once, not in surprise, almost like he understood that kind of thing. "I'm Ezra Callahan," he said. "Live out near Milk Rock Ridge. Came to town for wire and salt. Saw you sitting there. Looked like someone left you behind." She nearly smiled. "They did." Ezra rubbed his chin. "Well, ma'am, this ain't my business, but the station master's gonna lock up soon. Cold's coming hard tonight." "I don't have a place," Mabel whispered, then with more steel than she felt. "But I'll manage." Ezra glanced down at her bag. "That all you brought?" "Yes." He tilted his head. "Then I reckon you pack light on purpose. That takes a kind of courage." She blinked. No one had ever said that to her before. "You got somewhere to go come morning, no?" He looked away for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was low. "I've got a bunkhouse. Nothing fancy. Stove works. Got a dog that don't bark much. You can sleep there tonight if you like. Lock the door if it helps." She hesitated. The world had taught her to be careful. But something in the way he spoke, plain, unpolished like water, from a deep well, settled her nerves instead of stirring them. "I wouldn't impose." Ezra scratched behind his ear. "I don't offer what I can't hold. And I don't pity." Mabel nodded slowly. They rode in silence, the mare plodding steady through the twilight. As they turned onto a narrow path winding through bare cottonwoods, the ranch came into view. Modest, weathered, but standing proud with a lamp flickering in the window. "Built it myself," Ezra said. "Even after the fire took half of it. Took me longer, one hand and all." "It's beautiful," Mabel said. And she meant it. Inside the bunkhouse was a small cot with wool blankets, a tin basin, and a kettle already warming on the stove. Ezra handed her a cup of broth. Not thick, but hot and made with care. She drank it slowly. "I won't ask what happened unless you want to say Ezra offered. But if someone left you out here like a sack of flour, they're the fool in this story." Mabel smiled for real this time. "Thank you." He tipped his hat. "I'll be over in the main cabin. Dog's name is Maple. If you need anything, she'll bark." She nodded. That night, Mabel lay under thick quilts with the wind howling gently against the walls. No voices mocked her. No one told her she was too soft, too big, too old. Just quiet and warmth, and one kind gesture offered freely. She slept deeper than she had in months. But what happens when kindness stirs something deeper than safety? Mabel stayed. She told herself it was just for the night, then just until the next train, then until she figured out what to do next. But mornings kept coming soft as the light spilling through the frost-blurred window. Ezra always left a small pot of tea on the stove. He never asked her to cook, never asked her to stay, never asked her anything that made her feel small. She swept the bunkhouse, repaired a curtain, washed her stockings by the creek. Each day she meant to go, but each day the world felt less sharp. Ezra didn't speak much, but when he did, it was worth listening to. Like the time he found her staring at the cracked mirror, rubbing the loose skin around her neck. "Time don't ruin beauty," he said, without looking away from the fence post he was mending. "It just moves it somewhere deeper." She hadn't known how to reply, so she didn't, but her chest had warmed like sun through glass. Still, there were things she hadn't told him. Couldn't. Like the way her last husband John from Indiana had smiled at the altar and turned cold the day after. How he'd made her feel like she took up too much room. How he'd once cut up her best dress, said it made her look like a balloon with sleeves. How he never hit her. No, but words sometimes bruise deeper. She hadn't told Ezra that she once sent for another suitor before him, a man in Nebraska who wrote sweet letters, until she sent a photograph. He never wrote again. Mabel still kept that picture tucked in her Bible even now, a reminder of the version of herself she tried to believe in. One afternoon, Mabel walked out behind the barn and saw Ezra in the shed. He was sawing planks with one hand steady and methodical. She leaned against the frame watching. "How'd you learn to do all that one-handed?" He didn't stop sawing, didn't have a choice. "Folks won't hire a man like me, so I built my own place instead." "You ever wish you'd had help?" He paused, eyes lifting to hers. "Every day, but I don't wish for different hands, just someone who sees me anyway." That sentence, it split something in her. Later that night, as they sat on the porch with tea and silence between them, Mabel finally spoke. "My first husband didn't like silence, said it made him feel watched." Ezra looked at her. "I like silence," he said gently. "Feels like the only time the world ain't asking you to be someone else." She smiled. It broke and rebuilt her all in one breath. She wanted to tell him everything, but fear held her tongue. What if she spoke too much? What if he saw her pain and mistook it for weakness? What if he found out she had no money, no home to return to, no plans beyond this quiet porch? Would he turn away too? Ezra didn't rush her, didn't push. He simply passed her the last biscuit and said, "You got nothing to prove here. Just sit with me. That's all." That night, Mabel wept softly into her pillow. Not from sadness, but release, as if the grief she carried had finally been given permission to loosen its grip. But letting go of fear takes more than one gentle evening. And love, real love, asks for a kind of courage she hadn't quite found yet. But when words are still trapped, what will it take for two broken hearts to begin naming what they mean to each other? It was a Tuesday when the storm rolled in. Not the thunder kind, but the quiet one. Gray skies and a wind that rattled shutters like a whisper at the back of the throat. Ezra had been gone since morning off to check the cattle line past the ridge. Mabel busied herself in the kitchen, kneading bread like her mother used to sleeves rolled high, fingers coated in flour and thought. She hadn't told Ezra about the letter. It had arrived the day before. A legal note from Indiana confirming the sale of her late husband's estate. They'd found her finally to inform her she had a small share, just enough to start again somewhere new. Somewhere far, somewhere clean. She stared at the parchment. The numbers meant nothing to her now, not since Ezra. But money, real money, whispered of independence, of escape, of being able to build without owing anyone anything, not even gratitude. And yet, her hands did not reach for the travel bag. Ezra returned at dusk, boots muddy and hat dripping. He carried a sack of carrots under one arm and placed it by the counter with a grunt. "You been crying?" he asked softly, eyes scanning her face. She froze, startled by how quickly he saw her. "Bread's in the oven," she said instead. He didn't press. He never did. But he did sit beside her as she folded laundry later, his one hand helping smooth pillowcases she didn't know she'd wrinkled. "I got a question for you," he said finally, eyes on the slow fire. She waited. "Why'd you really stay?" Silence hummed between them. Then Mabel said the truest thing she had said in a decade, because for once, no one asked me to leave. Ezra didn't smile. He simply nodded as if that truth fit perfectly into the shape of his own. Then he took something from his coat pocket, a tiny carved bird whittled from cedar. "Wings out, beak up mid-flight." "I made this for you," he said. "Thought maybe you'd understand it." She held it in her palm like it was breath itself. "You think I'm flying," she whispered. "I think you're free, and I think you always were. Just needed someone who didn't clip you for it." That night by the fire, Mabel did something she'd never done before. She told him everything. The wedding that felt like a sale, the bruises no one saw, the years of shrinking so men would feel tall, the ad that promised love but delivered shame. The photograph returned unopened. The letters never answered. Ezra didn't interrupt, didn't flinch. When she was done, she whispered, "I'm not much left." He reached for her hand. "You're more than I've ever met." She wept again, but this time the tears felt like spring. In the days that followed, she stopped apologizing for taking up space. She sang softly while sweeping. She tied a ribbon in her hair just because it pleased her, and she left the letter from Indiana untouched on the mantle gathering dust. Because sometimes the real freedom isn't leaving, it's staying and choosing joy anyway. But just as two hearts begin to heal, the world outside knocks again. What will Mabel do when her past and a new offer returns to test her choice? The snow came late that year, but when it arrived, it stayed. The prairie was covered in white like a peace offering, or maybe a clean page waiting to be written on. Mabel stood at the window with her hand wrapped around a chipped mug, watching the frost trace its patterns like memory on the glass. Ezra had gone to the barn to feed the mare. He'd offered to teach her to ride come spring, said she'd do just fine once she stopped apologizing to the saddle for her weight. She had laughed then, a full laugh. Not the quiet, embarrassed kind that faded into her throat. A laugh that stayed. The letter from Indiana still sat unopened on the mantel. Every now and then Mabel would glance at it, not with dread, but with calm. She no longer feared what it offered. Money, movement, a name not spoken in 10 years. She had once thought freedom meant distance. Now she understood it meant choice. And she had chosen this quiet house with its crooked porch, this man who carved her birds and never asked her to shrink, this land that didn't ask for her to perform youth or beauty or grace, but welcomed her hands, her silence, her soft humming. One day a knock came at the door. It was a stranger, clean coat, polished boots accent that didn't belong to the dust of Wyoming. He introduced himself as a lawyer. "Are you Mabel Quinn?" he asked. "Former wife of Edwin Quinn of Evanstown." She said yes slower than she meant to. "I represent a client," he continued, "who believes you were wrongfully deprived of assets tied to your name. There's an offer." He handed her an envelope, heavy, gold-sealed, cruelly official. Inside a proposal, a payout, a chance to return not just to money but to being someone else. A clean slate if she signed. "I'll need an answer within the week," he said, tipping his hat. That evening, Mabel sat outside on the steps, fingers cold, eyes full of wind. Ezra sat beside her, a blanket shared between them. "You gonna take it?" he asked. No anger, just the question. "I don't know," she said. But even as she said it, the truth bloomed in her chest like thawed earth. "I think," she whispered, "I think this is the first place that's loved me back." Ezra didn't say stay. He didn't plead. He just looked at her the way no man ever had. Not as a woman to be fixed or hidden, but as someone complete, worthy, not despite her age or size, but because of all she had carried and still walked on. They stood in silence, the fire crackling low, and it felt like dawn. Outside, the wind swept across the fields, but this time it didn't feel empty. It felt like music. Mabel made her choice, but will the town accept the life she's chosen? And what happens when someone from Ezra's past arrives with questions? The wind softened as spring tiptoed back into the prairie. Not loudly, not like a celebration, but the quiet kind of return, like a forgotten song finding its way home. The snow melted in shy puddles, the soil darkened, and buds began to peek through fence lines and firewood stacks. The land was still healing, and so was Mabel. But healing didn't always come as joy. Sometimes it came as a quiet absence of fear of pretending of shrinking. She no longer winced when she caught her reflection in the window. She no longer flinched when someone knocked at the door. Her hands had softened around things not from weakness, but from no longer needing to clutch so tightly. Ezra's home was nearly finished now. It wasn't grand, but it was honest. Each beam told a story of storms, weathered, of hands working through pain, of stubborn hope nailed in place like a vow. Mabel had sewn curtains that didn't match, and Ezra had built a table where no one had to ask for a second helping. They didn't call it our home, but they didn't have to. It was in the way she poured his coffee without asking, in the way he left her side of the bed warmed with a wool blanket even when he rose before dawn. One morning a letter arrived, this time not from Indiana or a lawyer, but from a woman named Claire, a mail-order bride still waiting at the edge of hope. She had heard somehow about Mabel's story, about the woman who had been laughed at for carrying nothing but an empty bag and had still built something worth staying for. The letter said, "They say you were once called too old, too soft, too large, and yet you stayed. You were not chosen by a promise, but by a man who saw you as home. How did you know it was safe to stay? How did you know he wouldn't change his mind?" Mabel held the letter for a long while. Then by lamplight she wrote back, "I didn't know, but he never asked me to earn his love. He just let me be. I stayed because the silence no longer felt like judgment. It felt like peace. And if he ever changed his mind, I'd still be proud of the woman I became beside him." The next evening, Ezra placed a small carved box on the table. Inside a ring, rough, simple, made from a piece of cherry wood and a horseshoe nail. He didn't say, "Will you marry me?" He just said, "Would you like to keep staying?" Mabel's answer was not loud, but it was steady, sure, and full of spring. "Yes, and this time I bring more than an empty bag, I bring everything I've become." The prairie wind moved through the curtains that night, not harsh or hollow, but soft, like a blessing. They chose each other, quietly. But what will happen when someone from Mabel's past tries to claim what he thinks he still owns? The story isn't done yet. The knock came just after noon. Not the kind of knock Ezra used, firm but steady. This one had sharp edges. It didn't ask, it demanded. Mabel was shelling beans on the porch, her apron dotted with dust and contentment. The sound froze her. Not her hands, her breath. And she knew. Somehow, without seeing, she knew. When she stood and opened the door, he was there. Lyman. He hadn't changed much. Still wore boots too polished for dirt roads. Still smelled like pomade and cologne, trying to mask the sour undercurrent of control. And his voice, oh, that voice. Smooth as church pews, cold as the marble steps she once walked down on her wedding day. "Well, now," he said, eyes crawling over her. "Didn't think I'd find you this far west. You do know you still belong to me, don't you?" Ezra stepped up behind her, silent as always, but not absent. Mabel didn't flinch. "Not this time." "I never belonged to you," she said, her voice low but steady. "I was pushed, bought, shamed. That's not the same thing as love." Lyman smirked. "Law says different. We never filed for annulment. That makes you my wife in the eyes of the church. And I've got a lawyer saying I could sue this fella for theft of property." Ezra didn't raise a fist. He didn't spit or yell. He simply said, "She's not property. She's not a thing to be claimed. She's a woman with a name, a voice, and the right to walk away." Lyman sneered. "And what have you got to offer her? Half a roof and one good arm," Ezra shrugged. "Half a roof we built together. One good arm that held every board while she hammered every nail." For the first time in her life, Mabel didn't hide behind anyone. She stepped forward. "Between them, no paper, no preacher. No memory of yours can change who I am now. You called me too fat, too old, too weak. But I've built a home, and I've been loved better with silence and stew than with gold and threats." "You'll regret this," Lyman hissed. "No," she said. "What I regret is how long it took me to believe I was worth more than how I looked in someone else's ledger." The sheriff came the next day. Turns out Lyman had left a trail of broken contracts and threatened widows across 3 counties. Mabel's statement was one of many, and this time justice caught up. Lyman was taken away in cuffs. But Mabel wasn't triumphant. She didn't cheer. She just sat on the porch, hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight she'd finally put down. Ezra brought her a mug of warm coffee, set it gently beside her, and said, "You don't have to be strong today." And for the first time in a long time, she let herself cry. But not out of fear, out of relief. The snow melted slower that spring, clinging to fence posts like it didn't quite trust the sun yet. Mabel understood. Some wounds, even once cauterized, stayed tender. But the ground did thaw. The creek ran again, a little louder than before. And in the quiet spaces of that cabin, the one with lopsided shutters and a door that always creaked when it opened, something had settled. Not just dust or silence, belonging. Ezra didn't speak of marriage. Not right away. He didn't need to. Every day he chose her when he cooked her eggs and overcooked them, just a little, because he liked the way she laughed when they were crispy. When he let her win at checkers, but only sometimes. When he knelt on one knee, not with a ring, but with a sapling. Figured we could plant something together, he said. They planted it behind the cabin near the porch she sat on every dusk. An apple tree. It bloomed tiny blossoms that year, fragile, unsure. Mabel cupped one in her hand and for a long moment said nothing. Then I used to think only young things bloomed. Ezra kissed the back of her hand. Turns out we were just waiting for the right soil. They married that summer. No lace, no preacher with pomp and judgment. Just two people already home saying vows beneath an apple tree and a sky wide enough to hold all their yesterdays. The neighbors came. Mrs. Bixby brought molasses bread. Ezra's cousin played the fiddle. And the children, those wild, freckled, wind-kissed children, ran barefoot and laughed like it was the only sound that mattered. Mabel wore a blue dress, not to look young, not to look thin, but because it reminded her of the sky the day Ezra first saw her, not as a burden, not as someone to pity, but as a woman worth choosing. She no longer saw herself through the eyes of those who'd mocked her. She was no longer the woman with the empty bag. She was the woman who filled a house with warmth, who cooked too much soup, who knew how to stack kindling so it caught flame right away, who knew how to hold silence and when to break it. And Ezra, he never stopped calling her home. And so Mabel stayed, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because someone finally saw her as more than her size, her past, or her silence. She found a home in a man who didn't speak much, but whose hands built chairs and fences with care, and whose heart knew how to stay. Their love wasn't loud. It wasn't written in fancy words or bought with grand gestures. It was built slowly like supper from scraps, or trust after years of waiting. If you've ever felt overlooked, if you've ever been laughed at or told you were too old, too soft, too heavy, too much, remember Mabel. She wasn't picked because she changed. She was loved because she stayed true. Out here in the West, the soil's dry, the winds are harsh, but sometimes something tender still blooms. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe to None, Wild West Saga. That's where we tell the stories the world forgets and give them the dignity they deserve. Would you like to see what happens after Mabel and the rancher built their life together? Or would you like to hear another story like hers? Leave us a comment. We read every word. And until next time, stay kind, stay gentle, stay you.